Thanks for coming. I'm Darren, head of product at Paris, formerly known as the group policy guy. I say that I'm a reformed group policy expert. How many people use group policy in their day-to-day job, or even more of you than should? I am happy to answer questions about group policy. I will actually mention the words group policy in this talk because there is a role for group policy in this whole discussion, but this is not about group policy, sadly. So if you get enough beers in me afterwards, not right after, because it'll still be morning and that's probably not a good idea, but later on tonight, I'm happy to answer more in-depth group policy questions. This is me. I've been doing IT and software for a long time. I've been a group policy MVP for, as I said, far too long. I know a lot of the speakers here because we've been on this kind of perpetual circuit of speaking and writing for, I don't know, Sean, how long has it been? 20 years?
Probably.
Yeah, long time. And I do other things besides technology. I've been making wine for the last 3 years, and I've been a bike racer for 30 years, although I just got back into it. And for those of you from the East Coast, I'm sorry to say that I grew up in Philadelphia, so F you Yankees. And I was a speaker at DEC and Tech, so happy to be at this new incarnation. So, this is a really straightforward discussion about the problems aren't really all that new, and certainly AD is not new. Most of us have had AD for as long as AD's been around, 17 plus years. So what I'm talking about has been a kind of a topic of interest of mine lately, and that's the use of AD as sort of an information source for the bad guys to move around your network. And some tools that have come about in the last maybe year or so that have made that easier and more automated, and how you can protect against it. So how many of you have been thinking about this, talking to your IT folks about, or your security folks about this, thinking about AD as a potential source of exploit? And I'm sure, and most of you, and I'm sure it's come up more recently as we've had high-profile ransomware attacks that have targeted Active Directory, that have used Active Directory to move around. So my goal here is to sort of talk a little bit about this technology and some of the tools that people are using, and walk through sort of a path of getting to higher privilege using information in Active Directory. And feel free to ask questions, because this is a more kind of as Gil said, it's really about the community. So, I want all of us to kind of benefit from the experience that's in the room. I don't, by any stretch, know everything about the topic. So if you've had experiences and something that I say doesn't resonate, or you think that there's a better way of doing it, by all means. I have no ego in the game about having this discussion. This is really a discussion, as far as I'm concerned, about the best ways to protect ourselves, and using Active Directory for good and not for evil. So what's so bad about AD? Well, nothing in particular, other than the fact that it's been around for a long time. In a lot of organizations, what I've seen is that things like delegation have been handled haphazardly. I remember when I first got involved in AD, a vendor came to me and said, here's a tool for managing AD, except that it had been written for managing NT4. So it didn't really take advantage of all the robust delegation in AD. But when I looked at that delegation, I thought, man, there is a lot of complexity here. There's a lot of permissions, there's a lot of options for delegating control. It was very complex, and I thought, how do we make that simpler? And we ended up coming up with this idea of creating templates of permission that we could apply to objects. It ended up being productized into a product that Quest eventually owned, called Active Roles Direct or something like that. But that concept of managing delegation happened in, that the thinking about how do we keep this delegation well managed started early in the life cycle of AD. So it was an obvious problem, and I don't necessarily think everyone has handled it well over the years. How many of you have gone into your AD environments and brought up the ACL editor on an AD object and had to wait an appreciable number of seconds for it to finish rendering? Right. So that, generally speaking, is because there's been ACLs stamped on those objects from time immemorial, and you've got a lot of delegation inconsistencies, let's say. Some of you may have done a great job of managing it, but my guess is that at least some of you have what I'm describing as sort of haphazard delegation. Default permissions on objects have been optimized or were optimized for discovery and not security. So have any of you gone through the exercise of removing authenticated users' read access to your directory? Right. You have. That's excellent. I mean, it's not necessarily a requirement across the board, but the notion that AD was built with read access across for all authenticated users is a great idea in 1999, 2000, maybe not such a great idea in 2017. So really the focus is how do we make sure that the things that should be discovered by the right people are discovered, and the things that shouldn't be discovered by the wrong people aren't discovered. Yeah. In sufficiently large environments, you don't know what you don't know. I mean, this is just a nod to the fact that in really large enterprises with tens or hundreds of thousands of users, 10x that in groups, it's really tough to figure out what you have as a whole, to get a picture of it. The tools that are out there, in 17 years of Active Directory being in the wild, I've yet to see a really good tool for assessing ACLs across an entire environment. It's just hard to do. There's a lot of them. In a large environment, it takes forever. So this challenge of you don't know what you don't know makes it really tough to get control over what you need to get control over. Attackers have gotten more sophisticated. So this is old news, but people are not just interested in going after somebody's PC. They're interested in going after a network. Advanced persistent threat, as the name implies, is about being persistent in an environment and moving around and getting access to things that are good for attackers but bad for you. So the sophistication of attacks has gotten much greater, and the things that we always assumed were sort of hidden in plain sight, like Active Directory, like group policy, are now being taken advantage of by people with bad intentions. So I think that the key message there is, AD is really, it's the backbone for a lot of organizations. Most of you are using AD for authentication and authorization for not just desktops anymore, but your critical line of business applications, non-Windows systems, whatever the case may be. AD is sort of the backbone, and it's also a potential source of information for people that are looking to do bad things in your network. So how do we deal with this? So what are some of those common points of weakness? Many shops have gotten better about domain admins. How many of you have a rigid policy about who gets put into domain admins or how many privileged users you've got? Right, so at least half of you. It's always been a source of problems, and actually now with Azure AD, I was just having a conversation with someone who shall remain nameless, who was telling me that they're basically having the same problem in Azure AD, where people are getting stuffed into global admins as a default. So, this problem, and it's a human problem, right? Because when you're in the middle of it trying to troubleshoot something, do you really want to think about least privilege? No, you want to just put the user in the group that they need to get the job done. And that's often what's happened over the course of history with Active Directory and now Azure AD. So really it's about getting better about domain admins, but also about that kind of like the sort of next tier of administration, because those are the folks. Domain admins is kind of an obvious one, and the other built-in groups that are privileged. But it's the next tier of privilege that you sort of have to think about now. So most privileged group memberships are usually readable by authenticated users. That's an important piece of information to have. Who are the privileged users in this organization? It's easy to ask who's in domain admins and get the answer. It's a lot more interesting to me as an attacker to know about that second tier of admins, because those are the ones that are probably have access to the corporate data in the database applications that are, storing credit card information or storing customer information. That tier is not logging in as domain admin, they're logging in as their application admin accounts. And so those are the ones that we're really interested in. ACLs on AD objects aren't granted with an eye towards unwanted exploitation. So what that simply means is, if I can fish around AD and get useful information about what's in AD from a privileged access perspective, if I can answer the question, what groups and what users have privileged access in this environment as a regular user in AD, just by asking the question, then I've got a lot of useful information to be able to create a blueprint for moving around that environment if I have the right tools. And as an example, who are you granting reset password rights on your admin accounts to? If a lowly help desk person can reset the most privileged user account in your environment, is that such a good idea, right? If you're not controlling who can modify group objects or user objects, then if you get to one of those lowly admins accounts as an attacker, you now have this ability to up-escalate yourself into essentially these more privileged users by virtue of the fact that I can reset a password, or I can take ownership of their object and change their ACL, or I can modify group memberships because I have that right to do that. So all of those sort of ACL weaknesses that you have, you don't think about them as weaknesses, they're just part of doing business, right? You have a bunch of help desk people, they need to be able to reset passwords. If all of those things are in place, then you're basically giving the attacker a blueprint for how they can get to those objects, those more privileged objects, and take advantage of them. There's a great, I think I have a reference to it in here. How many of you are familiar with Bloodhound? Cool. So Bloodhound is a tool that was developed by some security researchers. I won't get all of their names right, but there's I'll have a link in here for the discussion. But the Bloodhound, I first saw it at Black Hat in 2016, Black Hat conference in Vegas, where they sort of debuted this tool. And in the last year, they've done some work on it. Bloodhound is basically automating this path to escalation within your network, using information not only on Windows desktops and servers, but also in Active Directory, and in kind of clever ways, in fact. And all this information, again, has been out there for years, and they just finally got smart about using this information to help map out that path to getting to escalation. One of the things that they talked about in Bloodhound in the most recent version is something called the ACL attack path. And that's using access rights on AD objects in nefarious ways. So before it was just getting information, now it's about looking at the access control lists and seeing who has access to what objects. If I compromise a help desk admin, a help desk user who has reset password on a privileged server object or user object, then I can get to that user, and now if I can compromise the help desk user, I can reset the password on that server user, and now I'm that server user, and I'll show you that in a little bit. Chris, yeah?
The one point to make is that the current version of Bloodhound does not correctly identify all of the attributes it needs to calculate the paths. So if you use it as an audit tool, it's not going to show you all the potential paths somebody has.
Yep. I think it's a really good point. What Bloodhound shows for me is the potential for using information in Active Directory to do bad things. And it highlighted for me, it was kind of an aha moment when I was sitting in this talk, of the potential for this information being used poorly. And I think that's the biggest takeaway that I got from it. There's some technical implementation challenges, and I think the good news is it's open source, so we can all contribute to make it better. Feel free. I saw some great opportunities for group policy stuff that I could improve on in there. So, speaking of which, most GPOs that control privileged access on endpoints are readable by everyone. How many of you remove authenticated users read from all your GPOs? Awesome. Only 3 of you. We'll talk about that. Yes, you can. You don't need to do it from all your GPOs, so I won't make it sound bad, but.
Is there a patch or something that made big inspiration to the
Yes, there was MS 16072. I was very familiar with that, and what it did is it changed the security context for user GP processing. So it prevented, it basically, user GP processing ran in the was changed to run in the context of local system. And it required you to make a change on the ACLs if you had used security group filtering on your GPO. It was a total Microsoft cluster. It caused a lot of people to have breakage. I'm sure, I see a few nodding heads, so I'm sure some of you experienced it.
Tons of hours of
Yes.
remediation.
Yes, tons of hours of remediation. I think I wrote a script on my blog that would go through and find all those GPOs and re-ACL them, but it was a total cluster. And you know, it was Microsoft trying to address a real problem, which was a security, I don't remember all the details, but it was a security hole that was created by virtue of how user-based policy processing was happening. And so they were trying to solve a real problem. The problem was they didn't communicate with anyone about it in advance. They just fixed it and broke all these people's environments. So. Many administrators still don't have a tiered system administration. This is sort of, you know, there's a lot of different ways to prevent credentials from being littered across your environment. And I'm going to talk a little bit about credential theft in a second. But how many of you have, so in the Pass the Hash white papers that Microsoft came out with, really famous white papers, really well written, well articulated, they talked about the notion of tiered administration, and I'll talk about it in a little bit. But this idea that certain administrators can only log on to certain systems helps to mitigate some of these problems that I'm talking about, because it helps prevent the attacker from hopping their way to systems that they shouldn't. And that, I think, doesn't get as much attention as it should. There's a lot of software products out there for doing bastion hosts, jump boxes, you know, session management. All those are good, but I also like the simple, relatively simple approach of a tiered management system, a tiered administration system. And that's often not done. So if you've got, just to kind of drive the point home, if you've got administrators, domain admins logging into workstations, well, why? I mean, there's no reason for that. Or any privileged group for that matter, logging into a workstation. Let me take that back. Any domain-wide privileged group logging into a workstation. So there are ways of getting around that. Some of them software-based, some of them just simply process-based. But I'm a firm believer in that kind of segregation of duties within your administrative model. So credential theft, I mean, this is probably common to everyone, but I'm not going to assume anything, and I'm just going to kind of go through it. How does it happen? You compromise a user on one machine. There's plenty of tools out there to find credentials that are sitting on that machine. I'll show you that in a little bit. You find some interesting credentials. You interrogate the environment with some of the tools that I just talked about. And that helps you find other interesting users. And you make your way to what I think one term that was in the original Bloodhound blog was derivative local admin. You find your way to increasing levels of privilege to get to this local admin state, or ultimately to domain admin. I have a link in here to a tool called Death Star. I love the fact that techies, name their products and their technologies with science fiction, because I'm a techie, I'm a big science fiction fan. It's always cool to see a technology that has a cool name like Death Star. Now, Death Star may not be the best choice given how all of the Death Stars seem to have ended up, but it's still, kind of cool. All right, so finding credentials that are interesting and moving to higher value users and machines. And it's really amazing, actually, when you think about it. If you try to think about this in your environment, and maybe the point will get driven home more sort of clearly when I get into my demos. But it's relatively easy if you know where to look to make this movement around in an environment that's not thought about this. And I'm sure some of you have worked in those environments. I have seen those environments. I still see those environments, which really kind of actually shocks me. But I think it's kind of to my point earlier about people just not having the time to think about this. If you're not in a large shop with lots of dedicated resources, you sort of leave everything at the default. You take the easy path because it's the fastest path to get work done. It's all about making the business function. So really that's your priority, but you really do have to think about some of these more, not even esoteric anymore, but more interesting options for using the information that you maintain for your infrastructure against you. So credential theft it's a broad category. In the Windows world, pass the hash is probably the most common incarnation of this, the hash being a landman hash or LM hash. It really involves stealing the LM hash or even Kerberos keys, Kerberos TGTs of a user that's sitting in LSAS on the system. LSAS is the process that keeps the security subsystem, local security authority subsystem, I think is what it stands for. All those credentials, as we'll see, are sitting in memory unless you're using technology to particularly guard against them. It's relatively easy. Once you have local admin on a box, I think I talked about that. Yep. Once you have local admin on a box, you can get access to this. How many of you still grant local admin to all your users? Awesome. That is like the first time I've asked that question and no one's hand went up. Did I see a tentative hand? Oh, man.
At this point, no one's willing to admit it.
I know, right. That's probably true. I was telling this story the other day that I worked for a large financial services company. One of my former coworkers is in the room somewhere. And there he is. And we started with NT3.5, believe it or not, in SMS 1.0. Do not get me started. And we rolled out NT4, and I was responsible at the time for the NT4 sort of design of the desktop. And there was no way I was going to give administrator access in NT4. It was absolutely possible in NT4 in a large, complex financial services environment to do that. And then then the funny part is, I left that company and I went back like 5 or 6 years later, and they had rolled out Windows, whatever, I don't even know what it was. It was, I want to say it was like XP. Everyone had admin access. I'm like, come on, really? And they went through a whole exercise to try to strip out admin access in the time that I was there again. And it's just, if I hear people say, oh, we need to give admin access for the people to do their job, I call bullshit on that. It is absolutely not necessary, and today it is simply dangerous. So, not to mention, notwithstanding the credential theft issue, admin access is just a really bad idea. Have I made that point clearly enough? Credential theft is a common way of moving laterally in an organization. So I steal the credentials on this machine. I use them to get to this machine. I use those credentials to get to this machine, and on up the chain until I get to domain admin. Or it's not even, domain admin seems to be like the prize, but you can do a lot of damage without domain admin in a lot of organizations. So the stellar graphics capability that I have shows how this works. A single user gets malware, right? You find some lowly, seemingly non-important user that has malware, or that opens a piece of malware. The hacker gets their tool set onto that machine. They look for credentials. They find some credentials for another box. That box happens to have had a domain admin logged into it. They find that guy's credentials or gal's credentials, and suddenly domain admin is done. And again, this doesn't have to be the domain controller. It could be, finance, ERP system. It could be whatever. It's not going to be any better in the Wall Street Journal if it's your domain controller or your ERP system. So the point here is that there's a lot of opportunities for moving around once you're in. Some of the tools that are out there, so everyone knows about Mimikatz. Mimikatz is a tool that was developed by a guy called Benjamin Delpy in France. It does a lot of different things. It's kind of a Swiss Army knife of credential theft and ticket theft and all kinds of interesting stuff. There's other tools out there that do that, but it's sort of the most well-known. PowerSploit is if you've ever heard of Metasploit, it's a PowerShell version of Metasploit. I'm going to show you some of the tools in there. It's a great little tool set for getting information about your environment. Bloodhound I mentioned, and then DeathStar is the tool that I mentioned that uses information collected from DeathStar to sort of automate the process of getting to, in this case, domain admin, but like I said, it could be anything. Any questions about anything that I've talked about? There's the graphical kind of view of Bloodhound. Before I go into a demo, I just want to stop and see if there's any questions so I can drink some water.
Is there a way to get access to your slide deck?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure. But if not, then you can always give me your card and I'll email it to you. Okay, no questions? Cool. Let me see if I can get my demo to work. I guess one of the awesome things about Windows 10 is that the Windows Defender actually works. I was telling somebody earlier that I have to really make sure that Windows Defender is turned off because it nukes Mimikatz from my system every time I try to use it. Okay, so let me start from scratch here. So what I'm going to do, can everyone see the screen? Cool. So who am I? Who am I? Oop. Oh, come on. I am Brian, not the guy speaking in the other room. This is another Brian. And I'm logged onto this system. I am no one special, as you can see, except I'm a local administrator. So this will be instructive for those of you that are still local administrators. So I am Brian, logged into the local system as no one. Brian opens an email, unfortunately, and clicks on a link and downloads a bunch of malware. So now I am the attacker acting as Brian on this system. So what do I want to do? The first thing I want to do is I want to see what interesting credentials are on this system. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say psexec, our good friend psexec, and I'm going to elevate to local system. Mimikatz needs debug privileges on the operating system. The easiest way to get that for me right now is local system, but if you have a user that has debug privilege, then that's sufficient. So I'm going to go ahead and make my scroll bar useful. And I'm going to, I've copied Mimikatz to my box, so I'm going to go ahead and type Mimikatz, and I'm going to use this incredibly intuitive syntax to get logon passwords on this box. And there they all are. I'm going to go up to one that I think looks interesting. Let's see if I can find an interesting person. Let me see here. Hey, there's a guy that looks interesting, Joe Helper. There's his password, foobar123. So I am going to see what I can do with Joe Helper. I'm going to go to my script because I'm old and I don't remember all the things that I'm. All right, so I'm going to log in as Joe Helper. So I'm going to start a process as Joe Helper. So I know his password because it's right here, foobar123. So let me,
Darren,
yes.
does it get the password when it reads the hashes? It just has access to the hashes and then it tries to figure out the password, or does it actually, is the password just there automatically?
The password is in clear text for certain kinds of interactions on the box. So the password shows up in LSASS in clear text. So that's what you're seeing there. There might be other cases where I'm only going to have the hash, the LM hash, in which case there's an option in Mimikatz to pass the hash to a new process so that I can open the process just with the hash. But in this case, I have the password in clear text because Joe Helper is a help desk person that happens to have logged on to this box interactively.
Is there a policy that prevents the clear password from being cached like that?
Yeah, I'm sure. Is there?
Something revolved.
I'm not actually. That's a good question. I don't know.
Protect users and there is credential guard.
Credential guard. I'll talk about credential guard in a little bit. So credential guard is a feature in Windows 10 that basically takes what's in LSASS memory and sticks it over in an isolated VM that is communicated to only over RPC. Yes.
Yeah, if I may step into it, if you use credential guard, it doesn't protect you against those clear text passwords which are there.
Ah, right.
They will still be there.
They'll still be there.
Credential guard protects your Kerberos key and the NTLM hashes.
Right.
But if you switch into the Mimikatz view, you see that there are several SSPI packages that are in the memory.
Right.
And the one from which you see the clear text password is TSV for remote desktop because you single sign-on for remote desktop is turned on the computer.
Right.
For single sign-on for RDP to be working, you need that clear text password to be cached.
Right.
So this feature can be disabled using your policy. That's true. But then you will be asked for password if you don't use either the restricted admin mode using RDP or remote credential.
Remote
That's
credential guard.
That's
Yep.
the thing to use in instance.
Yeah.
But there is another part, the W digest. That's a Windows 10 computer, so you don't see a clear text password there. But if it were Windows 7, I hope you don't have Windows 7 in your environment, so that you already upgraded to Windows 10. But if you have, you need to do a registry key on the machine to disable W digest single sign-on, and then it will disappear from Windows 7. By default, it is there.
But there's some downsides in disabling W-Digest, I think, as well, aren't there? Some kind of downstream, if you're using Kerberos, there's some issues with disabling W-Digest?
I don't know of
We
any.
were actually talking about this and we kind of came to the conclusion that
Yeah,
it's
might be-
there, nothing is using it, so LDAP can, there are two protocols that, well, two tabs that can conceal this digest within using. This is HTTP, basically IIS, and this is disabled by default.
Right.
And LDAP would.
Stand up and speak up, it's really hard.
Yeah, no, it's good. I mean, this is the conversation that I was hoping we would have.
The other one with the LDAP that supports it, but
question, does anyone do W-Digest authentication on IIS or LDAP?
Have anyone seen digest authentication used in the last 10 years?
So you can freely disable single sign-on for
That's
W-Digest.
still digest.
Yeah, I agree.
That,
So, sorry for...
No, this is great. So Michael and Guy are giving a talk on passwords, which will be really awesome to see, and I'm looking forward to it. And they've done a lot of work in this area, so thanks for that. Thanks for jumping in. Okay, so I have Joe Helper's password. It's not altogether. If it wasn't in clear text, but I had his NTLM hash, I could essentially do the same thing. So I'm making it easy on myself in this case, but you may not have W-Digest available, or you may not have the clear text password available. If you have the hash, you can still do this. So I'm going to go ahead and log on as Joe Helper. Let me see if I did that right. Looks like I didn't, so let me try his password again. There we go. So now I'm Joe Helper. And Joe Helper, let's say I don't know anything about Joe Helper, but I was interested in him as an attacker. This is where I can start to use some of the tools in PowerSploit to get some information. So I'm going to go do a get net user. And so this module is not necessarily relying on, let's see, do I have PowerShell running? I don't have PowerShell running. Go ahead and start PowerShell. It's not relying on any AD tools being installed. It's just a set of commandlets that these guys have written for getting interesting information out of your environment. Yes. I didn't take the time to. So what this has done is it just spit out all the AD accounts in my environment. But what I want to do is find out about Joe Helper in particular. And there's Joe Helper, and he's part of the Help Desk Admins group. So that's interesting to know. So what else do I want to find out? Well, I want to find out an interesting target that I want to get to. So what are some of the interesting targets in the environment? Well, let's take a look at the AD structure of this domain. GetNetOU shows me all of the OUs in the domain. And it's amazing how much information you can glean by OU naming, right? I mean, we try to make the environment useful for us to administer, but sometimes that's also giving potential hackers information about our environment. I'm always interested in getting source code, so I think I like something about this dev OU. So I'm going to go ahead and keep that guy in mind. And let's go ahead and do a get net computer full data. And what that's going to do is it's going to return all the computers in the domain. And I'm going to look for one. If I was smart about this, I would use a select or a where object in PowerShell on the pipeline. But because I'm lazy, I'm just going to kind of scroll through and look for a machine that's in the dev OU. So I'm going to go up my list here. Obviously, I know as the author of this demo, I know what I'm looking for. So let's see if I can actually find it. But if I was a intrepid attacker, I probably would take some time to go through this information. So there's my server that I'm interested in, dev server 1. So dev server 1 is in this dev OU here. See that? So I'm interested in finding out who is administrator on dev server 1. So I'm going to try a different commandlet. And I'm going to say find GPO computer admin. And I'll tell you what this is doing in a second, because it's using group policy in fun ways. Dev server 1.stmlab.net. So what this is doing is it's looking for restricted groups policy. How many of you use restricted groups or some other kind of group policy to control local administrator membership? Okay, a few of you. Actually, it's less than I thought, which is good. But it's a common mechanism to grant administrative access to domain groups using group policy, whether it's restricted groups or GP preferences, local users and groups. A lot of folks do that. And so I'm going to go ahead and interrogate using this commandlet. This actually takes advantage of the fact that GPOs are read-only. Read-only. So I'm sorry, that are read accessible to authenticated users by default. So I can, as a regular user, again, I'm Joe, I'm running this PowerShell session as Brian. So I am doing all of this stuff, all of the information that I just got is unprivileged. I'm not running as Joe Helper or Help Desk admin, I'm running as Brian. So all of this information that I've just gotten is just as a regular user in the domain. So now what I see is that the server admins group has been granted access to this computer via a restricted groups policy. So now I have a potential target. So who's in server admins? Who am I interested in trying to find? Well, I'm going to do a get net group member on server admins to find out who the members of it are. Again, this is a part of the PowerSploit toolkit. And again, I'm doing this as a regular user. Didn't copy, so let me do this. Get net group member, group name, server admins. And there's this, I mean, obviously this is a simple environment. Your list may be longer, but there's this user called Bill Server. Okay, what do I know about Bill Server? Well, how about I get the ACLs on Bill Server to find out how he's been resolved. So what I'm interested in finding out, and I'm gonna, oops, I think I nuked my first. There's this commandlet in PowerSploit called getObjectACL. So what I'm interested in finding out, let me make this a little bigger, is what are the ACLs on Bill Server. So I'm passing getObjectACL to Bill Server. I'm asking it to resolve GUIDs because I want to see all the different permissions in their friendly name format. And I'm going to see if my help desk admin guy that I've just compromised, Joe Helper, has any ACLs on Bill Server. Now, I've obviously shortcut a couple steps here. I may not know that help desk admins has access to Bill Server, but I'm trying to find a way to get to that Bill Server account. So I'm going to go ahead and hit getObjectACL on that and let it resolve that. So I'm basically querying the user account called Bill Server, who's in the server admins group, who has admin access on dev server 1. And I see here that help desk admins has user force change password on Bill Server. Makes sense, right? Help desk needs to be able to reset passwords. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back to my Joe Helper window. And just for the sake of expediency, I'm going to bring up 80 users and computers, but this could be done from the command line. And I'm going to say, Bill Server, I'm going to reset his password. Remember, I'm doing this as Joe Helper, whose credentials I stole. So I'm going to come in here and set Bill Server's password because I can. And now Bill Server is mine. So now I own Bill Server, and that means I own admin on dev server 1. Any questions on that path that I just took? Now, I'm not going to go all the way up to, trying to get domain admin, but essentially I've escalated myself at least one step along the way. Okay. A couple things that I just wanted to point out. It's essentially, I'm using information that's in Active Directory that's readily accessible to regular users. So group membership, ACLs on objects, group policy objects. So there's this GPO within PowerSploit, or this commandlet in PowerSploit called find GPO location. I can feed it a username, and what it's looking for, sorry, my copying and pasting skills are limited today. So it's looking for GPOs of interest, which means restricted groups policy or GP preferences, local users and groups, where this user has been granted admin access. So now what I've done is I've gotten a list of machines where Bill server has admin access. Here's my dev server 1 in the dev OU, but oh, I also have these boxes over here in this OU. So lots of places where Bill server, the credentials that I just reset for Bill server can be stolen and used. I also built, if any of you have been to my gpoguy.com site, you know I have a bunch of freeware up there. And I also, there's a version of the, so Microsoft came out with their group policy PowerShell module, I don't know, a few years ago. They were late to the party, let me tell you. I built a GPMC module in 2007 that did most, if not, and actually more than what the Microsoft group policy module does. And one of the things that I do is I output settings so you can get a list of settings across your entire environment. So what I've done here is I've written a little function called get security GPOs. And it's really rough, but what it does is it takes advantage of the fact that I can output settings from GPOs. And let me just go ahead and kind of show you a quick example of this. So again, I'm running as a non-privileged user. I'm going to output all settings across all GPOs that, let's see, let me just grab the relevant bits here. So I'm gonna do this. I'm gonna say, let me clear my screen. GPOs equals get GPO all. So now I have all my GPOs in the environment. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to pipe that, or actually I'm going to use a for each because Microsoft's commandlet doesn't deal with the pipeline or the group policy module doesn't deal with the pipeline very well. So I'm going to pipe the contents of that to my out SDMGP settings commandlet. And what you're going to see in a little bit is every security setting within the domain being output out. So again, I'm read-only, or I'm a read user, I'm an authenticated user, non-privileged user in the environment, and I'm just basically dumping my entire security posture. Thank you, Debbie. So there are all my settings, which GPOs they're in, and their values. And so you can use this information, obviously, in lots of nefarious ways. You get a complete picture of what the security posture of the environment is by virtue of group policy. Now that may seem to argue against using group policy, but I would never say that. All right. So any questions on any of that? Yeah.
So is the assumption then, or the conclusion to draw, that you can carry on using those tools that are there to develop the administrative scope on machines, things like the local users and groups, the restricted groups, as long as you're not giving read-only on authenticated users?
So the question is it fair to say then you can continue using all those group policy areas as long as you're not using authenticated users read? And that's a great segue question into what I'm about to talk about next, which is reducing information exposure. And I have 10 minutes, so I'm going to try to do this in a way that doesn't make it sound like I'm, on helium or something. All right. Microsoft talks a lot about assume breach. Yeah, okay, whatever. That's like saying there's always a fire in my house. And how would you react if there was always a fire in your house? It would be really unfortunate. So let's just think about, like, take a step back and think about how do we make this whole thing harder for the attackers to move around the environment, take longer to get where they want to get, if at all. So reducing the information exposure to privileged users and groups and GPOs, constrain where credentials are lying around, use the built-in technologies. Michael mentioned Credential Guard. This is a feature in Windows 10 Enterprise and in Server 2016. Since we're in an Active Directory conference, I will say bad things will happen if you turn on Credential Guard on a domain controller, so don't do it. One note about Credential Guard, for any of you that are still running NTLM v1, it automatically gets disabled in NTLM when Credential Guard is turned on. So please, I hope you're not in that case, but it should not be a reason to not deploy Credential Guard if you have Win 10 Enterprise. And then monitor, monitor, monitor. This white paper came to me recently. It is an exhaustive document on events that can thrown in the Windows event log when certain types of attack operations are going on. It's really thorough. So I'd highly recommend checking it out because half the battle is knowing that something is going on, as we have seen from a lot of these high-profile attacks, where users are in the environment 3 months, 6 months, doing bad stuff until finally they get discovered. With respect to AD and GP delegation, I highly recommend hardening privileged groups. Now, this is a hard thing to do for a lot of environments, again, because you don't know what you don't know. You oftentimes don't know who needs access to the member attribute on privileged groups. You can be sure that members need access, but you probably also have application accounts that they're using those groups for authorization that need access to view the group membership. It's an exercise worth doing, I think, because the information in privileged groups really is a roadmap to who has important access in your environment. So being able to control the access on that attribute alone is worth a lot. Delegation of full control or right on the member attribute should be restricted. So who can change membership in groups should be other highly privileged users, right? It shouldn't be the guy that you've outsourced to some other location who's getting paid 36 cents an hour to handle help desk calls. Hardened privileged users, all right? The ability to reset the password on a privileged user or to take ownership or who has full control should be tightly controlled. And I talk about the tiers here. Hardened security-related GPOs. GPOs that grant privilege access should not be world readable. I'm not talking about every GPO. I'm talking about the ones that are doing restricted groups policy, local users and groups, user rights assignment. Remember when I said that for Mimikatz, you need debug privileges as one of the ways to get Mimikatz to work? Well, that's something they think granted through group policy. So you want to know where that's being done. This is the tiered admin model I mentioned. So tier 0 is your DCs, tier 1 is your servers, and tier 2 is your clients. So the way this works, this is straight out of the Microsoft white paper, this picture, but tier 0 can't log into tier 1, tier 1 can't log into tier 0, and shouldn't log into tier 2, and tier 2 can't log into tier 1. Yep.
What would you recommend around agents that are deployed across the estate, right? So
Service accounts you're talking about? Yeah, that's a really great question. Service accounts, if they really need to be on every machine across all the different tiers, then they need to be as least privileged as possible. So this notion of making a service account domain admins because the vendor says so, it just doesn't cut it. Chris?
yeah, you have on your domain controller.
Right. And if you can get away with it, if you don't have to have the same service account on every tier, then that further helps you restrict it. I don't know if some agents don't allow that. Let me keep going because I want to make sure that I get through all the content. I've got 1 minute left. I want to say something about hardening group policy objects. This is some guidance that I've been giving on my blog for a while now. If you have GPOs that are doing security things, they are most likely per computer GPOs. they, by default, even if you're just linking them to an OU and not security filtering them, they will grant authenticated users read access, read and apply group policy. Well, authenticated users don't need read access to those GPOs. So if they're targeting computers, you can just grant domain computers access if you're not doing any other security group filtering. If you want to get, and what this does is it essentially means that authenticated users can no longer read these GPOs, right? Because you need to be able to read to apply, but you don't need apply to read. You can have read as a separate permission. And read access to especially security GPOs should only be granted to privileged users. They're the end users or computers that need to process the GPOs. So again, I've got a GPO that's linked to an OU. There's no other filtering going on. If I remove authenticated users and add domain computers, then that means that you have to be local system to be able to read that GPO, which raises the bar. If I want to raise the bar further, I can create a security group for that OU of just the computers that are in that OU that's getting the GPO. And then only if you're on one of those systems, then you'll be able to read the GPO. That's all you need to do for security GPOs that are per computer, is use the machine account. I'm not going to have time for a demo, but if there's any questions after this, I'm happy to kind of talk through some of this as well. And of course, we have the party tonight, which is a great opportunity. Any final questions before I, yep.
You didn't mention.
And you know, having unique local admin passwords. I mean, this, I didn't show this. GP preferences passwords. I'm sure none of you are running that anymore. I have a little utility that I wrote that will go out and search for GP preferences passwords on a box, in a domain, and find them. One of the commandlets that I didn't talk about, let me just get to this quickly. So the point he made, denying logon, if you go into the pass the hash white paper and you read about how you implement the tiering system, it's through group policy deny logon locally or deny logon access from the network. Those policies help you enforce the tiering by basically preventing logon at each tiering level for the accounts that aren't part of that tier. But I do want to, to this point about local administrator passwords, I wrote this a while ago. It will go out and search your network for GPOs that contain that still use GP preferences passwords, which have been cracked. Microsoft published the key, the encryption key, as part of their technical protocol documentation. There's no one that should be using this anymore to set local passwords. This found the password. There's actually a PowerShell commandlet in the PowerSploit module. I think it's called getGPP. I'm probably going to get it wrong. Anyway, there's a commandlet in there that will unencrypt and show you in clear text the admin password within that GPO. This tool here will remediate this. If you have it, you can right-click on it and say remediate, and it'll basically blank out any C password entries you have for any of the, there's like 4 different areas in GP preferences that use passwords that use the same encryption key. You can essentially get rid of those using this. So I'd highly recommend that. And I think I'm out of time, so.
So you are, but it seems that they're deep in it. I don't see any movement towards the door. So it's your coffee break.
Yeah.
You can continue to have Darren answer questions, or you can grab your coffee and informally harass Darren.
Yeah.
Or you can do both.
Or you can do both.
Until the guys in the next room come charging back in.
Yeah, yeah. So question in the back, yeah. Amy.
What's your position for using protected users as a means of?
You mean like the protected user status?
Yeah, I think it's in 2012 it was introduced.
Yeah, I'm not sure which, honestly, I don't know a lot about what it does and doesn't do. I mean, there's probably, a guy you may, or Michael, protected user.
Hey guys, I heard applause from the other room, so we're about to be in
Thanks.